Welcome back to the Friends on Horses podcast. If you're like me, a curious horse nerd, this is your spot. We've got everyone from equine geneticists to nutritionists to top-level riders and even individuals who've been on epic adventures. So if you want to be inspired, learn a little bit, this is your spot. This is your pod. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Friends on Horses podcast, and I'm here with Katrina Chapman. And I'm excited about this conversation. I had the privilege to be on the Unbridled Equestrian Podcast not long ago. And it was fun for me. And I feel like my listeners, so you guys out there, will also enjoy Katrina's podcast. It's got a similar flavor of connecting with people who have different perspectives in the horse industry and sharing information, because we feel like everyone deserves access to all of this information. So anyways, so that's a side note. That's a little selfish. Oh, I think Katrina's awesome. I was on her podcast. Go listen to it. You'll like it. But aside from that, Katrina not only has the Unbridled Equestrian podcast, but also has Highland Saddles, a saddle fitting company, and Lovas Equestrian, which is a saddle making company, which I think is also incredible. And one theme that I got through this whole looking at Katrina's business model, it seems to be, in general, an inclusive, horse and rider first. All of these brands, really, they share that similar thread, which is so lovely and not always something that we see in our equestrian industry. So I haven't even let poor Katrina talk yet. But I will say, Katrina, welcome. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Oh, and thank you for such a warm welcome and intro. And I'm so excited as well. I've loved every conversation that we've had the pleasure of having so far. And really, I feel like our work is so aligned in terms of putting the horse first and really advocating for the horse and rider partnership, because there are so many different variables that play into that, and so many different pieces that as equestrians we can find ourselves struggling with. And to me, and I think to you as well, helping others in our community navigate those issues and helping the horses as well is such a huge part of our belief system and why we do what we do. So thank you for having me on and for the opportunity to have another great conversation. I'm so excited.
Yeah, me too. And actually, that's a great segue for me, because there are so many barriers to honestly to successful horsemanship and riding, and even having a positive experience with your horse. And what I understand from listening to your podcast is that how your saddle company came into being really started with your own personal experiences and barriers. So if you're comfortable just jumping right into that, I feel like that story is something people can relate to and gives them an idea of what your company is all about. Let's start there. Is that okay?
Okay. That sounds great. Yeah. And I feel like you heard a piece of it when we chatted on my podcast. And it goes even a little bit further back than that. So my first ever horse, I was almost 30 by the time I got my first horse. It had been a lifelong dream, but it was never something that was accessible for me financially. And growing up, I worked in the barns to pay for my riding lessons and to get any time in the saddle that I wanted. And I think that was really beautiful because it taught me the horse husbandry aspect of things, and that for every hour I got in the saddle, I was probably putting in 5 to 10 hours of hard work. And it made me appreciate so much the time with the horses. And I didn't view it as work at all at the time. But that's my early foundation in riding. And then when I got my first horse, I was almost 30. And he tore a suspensory almost immediately. And the vet said I needed to euthanize him, that I'd be wasting my money essentially trying to rehab him, that he was dangerous, you name it. And I just thought, how unfair that this sweet guy, he hadn't had maybe the best history prior to getting him. I think his previous owner was scared of him. He'd been left out in a field, and I think we realized after we did some imaging, maybe had a previous suspensory tear. So he came to me as a horse that had really just had a lot of bad luck. And I thought, I'm going to give up and euthanize him if I think there's things that I can do to help. So he ended up rehabbing and coming back totally sound, which was really cool. And in that journey, of course, while he was off, he lost top line and weight. And coming back, he needed a saddle that fit. And so that's when I really started my deep dive into saddle fitting. And I hired multiple saddle fitters to come out, and it was just not a good experience. It was like I felt being really pushy. Like I had one fitter punch him in the face, and he was really social and sweet and just totally misinterpreting his communication. And he was just looking around at her to engage, not in a way he wasn't going to bite her or anything like that. But I just really saw how often these horses get totally misread. And so that really opened my eyes to some things that a lot of my peers were also struggling with in the industry. And so I did a deep dive into saddle fitting. And unfortunately, many saddles later, that was Dylan. He ended up colicking and I lost him. And it was years later that I got my next horse, Ellie. And similarly, she'd had a really, I think, challenging past. And she was big and strong, and when I met her, she was really atrophied in her top line. She was coming back from some time off, but the saddle they were riding her in was sitting right on her withers, and I went to try her, and I was like, I can't sit on her in this saddle. So luckily I had a car full of saddles, and I tried a whole bunch on, and I found one that I thought, okay, I can at least try her in this. And she ended up being my horse. I just loved her right away. And there was lots. She was frantic and stressy and rushy, but there was something about her that I just fell in love with. And so right away, we kind of started this journey of building top line, building muscle, and trying to get her nervous system to rest and relax a little bit, because she was very much in this activated state a lot of the time under saddle, but very sweet and calm on the ground. And so it's like, okay, learned a little bit more about her history. And it was like, somebody's just pushed her too hard, too fast. She was a big, strong mare with big movements. So probably been a bit too aggressive with her, as we so often see with horses. And so we dialed her. I co-owned her with a girlfriend of mine, and we just dialed her way back. We were like, okay, you know what? We're just going to do light walk trot. We're going to do groundwork. We're going to build this horse back up to give her a proper foundation. And so that process was pretty lengthy. She ended up having a branch tendon injury pretty early on as well. It was a bit of a roller coaster, but in that, we ended up going through over 13 saddles in a year and a half.
Wow.
And it was just I felt like I was banging my head against the wall, because at this point I was already into saddle fitting based on my initial journey with Dylan and the things that I had learned there and really gotten an interest in it. But it was so frustrating. I would say on average, I usually have about 100 saddles in my inventory, ranging around about 20 different brands. And
Wow.
I found myself riding in a bareback pad quite often because I didn't have a saddle that fit her. And that was just maddening. I'm like, how ridiculous that I'm a saddle fitter. I have so many saddles. I have access to so many other fitters, so many brands. I don't have a damn this is
Wow.
and not only was it frustrating and demoralizing and debilitating in terms of our ability to make the progress that we wanted to make, it was also financially devastating. We ended up doing ulcer treatment in there and PRP and a bunch of other things for her injury. We were just shelling out tens of thousands of dollars for this horse that we either weren't able to ride most of the time, or we were riding in a bareback pad. So it just got to be unsustainable and really unmanageable. And we ended up deciding, after a bout of cellulitis and then return of the ulcer, we ended up retiring Ellie. And I really realized the need for better options because I wasn't the only person struggling in this way. I felt like I was seeing clients all the time who I didn't have a saddle for, and found myself feeling similarly frustrated by the fact that I couldn't help them solve their problems because the saddles that were available, the saddles that I could get my hands on, and the saddles that are being made out there often weren't in their price range, weren't what they or their horse needed, or a combination of those two things. So it meant that the vast majority of the time somebody was compromising. So we were compromising on budget, seat size, flap size, and people would often say, I'll compromise to myself as long as it fits the horse, which is a great notion in theory, but unfortunately it's a partnership. And so if the rider is compromised in terms of their position, then the team is compromised. And the tension that results in our body as a rider from making do with a saddle that's not really right for us, that ends up getting passed down to the horse. And even if the saddle fits them perfectly, we still end up struggling as a pair because we're not in unison. And as the rider, we're not balanced and supported in the way we need to be. So that was how the journey into creating my own saddles began. And I started with the most difficult to fit shapes that I would see. So you're really like shark fin withered horses that all of these sort of, especially for jump saddles, all these French jump saddles weren't really accommodating. And knowing it was really hard to find a wool-flock jump saddle that the average hunter-jumper rider actually wanted to ride it. So that was the beginning, and then the wide, sort of super flat-backed horses, it was really hard to find something for them as well, and it just grew from there.
There are so many questions in there for me, which is wonderful. And I love the journey that you went on. So I'm going to bustle back a little bit.
Absolutely.
Because there are a lot of people who struggle with finding a saddle for their horse and themselves, as you said, so much that they give up or compromise,
Yeah.
which is so unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I know that in the area that I live in, there are a lot of horse people, but we live far away from having access to good saddle fitters or even just a bunch of saddles to try. And they might go through 13 saddles, darn it, in a year. And it's nice to know that someone who really knew what she was looking at also has had that experience. So to paint a picture of what happens, let's go back to, so what about your sweet horse what about that body shape, what was so not right for all of these saddles that you were trying and looking at?
Great question. So it's kind of interesting because all of the saddles we had would work for a time. The trickiest thing is often that horses who have had prior damage to their top line, who have had compensation posturally, or even stress in their body or their nervous system when they're working, they become accustomed to a certain way of going or holding themselves that often relates to and results in more kind of sunken posture, atrophy in the top line, and just an overall compromised way of going. So it's a bit tricky because often as we start to untangle the things that a horse has been doing that aren't working for it, so improving the posture, improving the degree of relaxation, improving their overall way of going and their strength and their balance, so many pieces start to change alongside that. And so with Ellie, she was a chestnut, and I'd be interested to talk to you about this because I have certainly found anecdotally that chestnuts not only tend to be more sensitive environmentally, which we talked a bit about on the Unbridled Equestrian Podcast episode where I interviewed you, but I notice consistently that chestnuts are often a bit more sensitive in general. So sensitive to pressure bumps, sensitive to rubs, things of that nature. And I often find they're a lot less tolerant of saddles that don't fit or are causing discomfort. So I'd be interested to know if there's any backing to that. But really, Ellie had zero tolerance after her earlier experiences in life for discomfort. And so her threshold was just so much lower than it would be in a horse who didn't have all this previous trauma to their back. So when I got her, this horse was about 17.1 and a really big boned, sort of foundation Oldenburg, like really solid girl. And when I got her, she was like a medium narrow tree. Now, in that year and a half of going through 13 saddles, she was in double X wide by the end of it. So,
Wow.
it was a huge change.
That's
And
massive.
it's tricky because in that change, ideally, if we're also improving that horse's weave going in their balance, what we'll typically see is the balance points start to move back as they're engaging their hind end, elevating the forehand, utilizing their core appropriately. As we free up the thoracic sling and the front end is moving better. And often with that, we'll see changes in the relative kind of height and length of the wither compared to the back. And so are we getting more core engagement? So then sometimes we'll see horses really flattening out. But then sometimes as they learn to sit and elevate the forehand more, the wither will come up again. As much as the skeletal structures of the horse don't change beyond maturity, we see massive fluctuations posturally as horses change their way of going and their overall health, strength, and balance. And a lot of that ends up being tied to saddle fit. What I noticed with her and what I see with clients all the time is they will change. And if we don't adapt the saddle, they will revert back because they'll end up hitting this threshold where the pressure from the saddle is preventing further growth and development in that direction. And then we start to see the musculature recede, the postural changes go back to where they had been. But if you keep meeting them where they're at as they improve, they keep improving. The downside of that is that you have to keep evolving as they change. And so with her, I think it equated to about a 7-centimeter difference in her overall width. But she also went from having a gigantic shark fin wither where all of the spinal processes were quite exposed, like you could see the center of each vertebrae protruding because there was no supporting musculature around it, and her posture was quite sunken. And so she went from having a huge wither to, as she filled in and started elevating her forehand and engaging her core and sitting down and using her hind end, her back came up a ton and she got really like wide. So she ended up in a wide hoop tree from being completely A-framed and atrophied with major shoulder asymmetries. And so the stronger she got, the wider she got, also the flatter she got. And her balance point went from being quite forward, indicative of a horse that's pulling themselves along artificially, versus a horse pushing themselves from behind. And so as the balance point moves back and as the overall postural shape of that horse's top line changes, we actually need to be able to adapt the tree in accordance. So those were some of the big factors. Not only was she changing width-wise, but she was also changing shape-wise in terms of the wither and back proportions.
That is so beautifully answered. That is absolutely nice and clear, and I'm sure that our listeners are feeling the exact same way. And it brings up all these ahas. So I go, okay, so this is where the importance of, if you're going to have a saddle, adjustability becomes so important. And then from my perspective on like mechanics, rehabilitation, and performance, I often say to clients that a saddle, if you're not evolving your saddles, it's a lot like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it's a lot like, it ends up being like kinese tape. So you have kinese tape on a horse to either help them, right? Because it's that feedback. It helps them figure out how to move. And if the kinese tape isn't applied correctly, or if you continue applying it in the same way, even when the mechanics have changed, now we're at a point where we're limiting mobility and movement and progress. So it's this tactile feedback that the horse is getting all the time, and they're going to adapt to it, and it needs to continue to evolve, which is, it sounds to me like what you're talking about, something that can be really hard for people to understand. And then they go, oh my gosh, I paid so much money. I paid 10 grand for this custom saddle. And then we've been working so hard and things have been going so well. And now I have to buy a different saddle. What's going on here? And that's hard.
It's really hard. Yeah. Yeah. And it's something that I see all the time with clients and their horses. And I think really there's so many factors to this as well, because from a mindset perspective, these things haven't necessarily been understood or taught in the industry. And so I think a lot of us go into it with the mindset that if we buy an expensive saddle, that equates to fit and quality, or that because we invested in a custom saddle, that saddle should therefore fit now and into the future. And the unfortunate thing is there's so many pieces involved in that puzzle. And here on Vancouver Island, as opposed to where you are, a lot of horses don't have access to friends, forage, or freedom. And so we tend to see compromise in their overall body structure and a lot of fluctuation in their muscle tone, their weight, and their overall posture in response to those things. We're also really reliant on external sources of hay. So there's a lot of inconsistency in the protein content and other nutrient contents of the hay that we're getting from one load or shipment to the next. So there's just a lot of pieces relative to horses that are moving consistently in more of a herd dynamic and who have more access to forage. Horses, say where you are, I've noticed, tend to fluctuate considerably less in their body condition from season to season, month to month. But horses around here and Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland, we've got really small paddocks for the most part. The horses are not moving. And so we tend to see much more significant fluctuations in their top line based on all kinds of other environmental factors. When I say environment, I'm talking weather. We have a lot of horses that just stand around in the rain. They're not moving. Again, the hay piece. There's some issues often that we found with water quality in different areas. And so all of these pieces are impacting the horse on the inside. But those differences or those changes end up manifesting on the outside. And so, interestingly, with Ellie, we saw a lot of improvement in her top line and a lot of changes as a result of that. But I also see lots of horses where they go up and down constantly. And the riders are like, their workload hasn't changed. So I don't understand. But meanwhile, they changed barns, they've changed trainers, they've changed farriers, they've changed feed. They've changed all these other pieces, and they're not necessarily comprehending that all of those changes result in not only internal but external fluctuations in their horse's body condition. And with that, we see changes in the way their saddle is fitting for them. So it's not that different than if we have a pair of jeans that have no stretch, and some days we put them on and they feel fine, and other days we put them on and we can barely do them up. So our bodies fluctuate constantly, but horses tend to do that on an even larger scale and for reasons and variables that we often don't consider. So that can be tricky because no matter how much you spend on a saddle today and no matter how well it fits today, there's just no guarantee that it will fit in a month, 2 months, 6 months, or a year. Because a lot of the time we're dealing with top lines that aren't really moving, that aren't really as well developed as they ought to be because they're not moving. And we're dealing with all kinds of other sort of unnatural external sources that contribute to that horse's body condition.
That makes a lot of sense. And I really like that you're pulling in this more holistic approach, right? You're looking at all of the pieces that make up a healthy horse. As you said, our access to friends, forage, freedom, the nutritional components, stress components, like you talked about a bit more in your first horse's experience, right? Just showing up and we're stressed out, and that's going to impact how you're folding and moving your body. So there are a lot of things that can impact your saddle fit among everything else. I love that. So I actually am going to pull back again and look at kind of the story that you're talking about and bring in an important piece that you touched on. You touched on the fact that often we are looking for a saddle that'll fit our horse, and we're willing, because we love our horses so much, to compromise on saddle fit for us too. And I have certainly been that rider. In fact, one of my most expensive saddles ever I'm just like checking the box. I'm like, oh, I wish I had Katrina because I'm just going, all right. So I had the saddle fitter who is, I don't care that you're broke. You have to spend a monumental amount of money on this single saddle for your horse because this is the only saddle in the whole world that will fit it. And then also, and just so you know, we're not going to really worry about you or look at you sitting in it or see how you feel about it.
You're irrelevant.
Yeah, you're irrelevant. I'm like, did not serve me. And the next saddle fitter I had out was going, what was this person talking about? There are lots of options, and this is not supporting you at all. Obviously, both are important. And from my work perspective, I want my riders to feel confident and comfortable in the saddle so that they can move well and help their horse as well. But from your perspective, if the saddle doesn't fit the rider, what are we compromising?
Yeah, great question. So it never ceases to amaze me how many different ways we might be compromising, depending on what's not working in the saddle for us or our horse. And when I was talking about Ellie earlier, I was talking about balance point. So what we could call the sweet spot of a saddle or the balance point is going to be where the rider ends up sitting. Now, if the sweet spot works for you and your horse, that's going to naturally create alignment in your shoulder, hips, and heels. So you can just sit in a spot where you feel balanced, where you don't feel like your pelvis is splayed too far open in the front, which can end up resulting in a bit of a chair seat, or you don't feel like your thighs lack a little bit of support, i.e. maybe the twist is too narrow, that ends up tipping you forward. And so much of it is really geared on how a saddle will orient a particular rider's pelvis. And that's tricky because everyone's pelvic structure is totally different. And sometimes we see saddles that are geared towards the female pelvis or other saddles that are made typically for a male pelvis. But the reality is everyone's pelvic structure is totally different, whether male or female. And there's some general similarities, of course, a female pelvis might have these characteristics relative to a male pelvis. But within that, there's so much variation. And then if we talk about relative femur length to shin length, for example, if we're thinking of a rider's leg coming out and then back under them, if we have a longer femur than we have shin, that's always going to be a challenge to get the appropriate balance. And so there, our flap shape and the positioning of our stirrup bar end up making a big difference in determining whether we're always fighting a chair seat or we're naturally able to put our leg under us. And so sometimes we're fighting physics, right? If we have a longer femur than we have shin, this part's always going to have a harder time getting back under us. But there's aspects of the saddle, so where's the balance point? If the balance point's a little further forward, that's going to help. If the stirrup bar is placed a little further forward, it's going to help. Oftentimes that's a rider who, if we put them in too forward a flat, it just gives the knee and thigh room to gravitate forward, therefore exacerbating that chair seat. So there's lots of little pieces, including seat depth, twist width, and overall tree shape. Sometimes it's the way the seat is strung itself. So there's lots of pieces that can end up either helping or really hindering us as riders. And what I see probably the most frequently is the trainers are hammering somebody on their position, and I can look at it and say, oh, that they're tilting forward because of their saddle, or they're getting left behind because of their saddle. And the trouble is, no matter how hard you fight that, no matter how much time and energy and effort you spend working on improving your position, you can't fight physics. And so if the saddle is forcing you into that position, you're just never going to win the battle. So you're always going to end up compensating. And because you're not in balance in your own body, it's really harder for your horse to then be in balance underneath you. So even if they were naturally balanced, carrying around with saddle and rider plus concussion in every step, we're not looking at much less than 200 plus pounds every step that horse takes. And so if that 200 plus pounds is out of balance and alignment, guess what? Their job becomes significantly harder just trying to balance themselves. And then so many horses aren't balanced either, and we wonder why we can't get them going straight, why they can't elevate the forehand, why they're not lifting their feet up properly over the jump. all these pieces that become really relevant as we're trying to advance in the sport. Much if you're working with a running shoe that doesn't fit, every step you're going to be uncomfortable. So many of us get accustomed to fighting our saddles every step, but thinking that we're the problem.
Oh, I love that so much. And I think especially working with Annika McGivern, my sports psychology friend, she talks a lot about how much onus we put on ourselves. We go, my horse isn't able to do this thing. What's my problem? Why can't I make this happen? I must not be skilled enough. Maybe, as you said, this balance issue is that the saddle is turning the person into a backpack full of rocks that's shifting to one side or the other, right? It's putting everybody out of balance. So it's not necessarily just the rider's fault. So a couple things from that. You mentioned chair seat is obviously one of those big hitters. Let me think here. There's one other example that you gave that was great. Everything you're saying is great. But my next question is going to be for people who don't really know what they're looking for to figure out whether or not, if they're trying to decide, is this my saddle that's throwing me and my horse out of balance? For the rider, what are some key pieces that you might be able to tell people to look for? Because there's obviously things that a saddle fitter will be looking at that maybe they can't see. But for the general public, for the people out in the Kootenays where I live, if they're like riding along going, this problem keeps happening, how might they go, maybe that's my saddle?
Yeah, great question. So there's a couple things that I'm thinking in line with that might be really helpful. So I've actually written a saddle fitting guide that's got some helpful visuals. So why don't I give you that to link? And I can also link you to, I've developed this sort of horse in hand series where we can gauge how well your saddle is actually working for your horse. And so the horse in hand series is all based on if you have a horse and you have a hand, you can do these really simple gauges to see, okay, is there something wrong with my saddle's tree width, tree shape, balance point, that sort of thing. So before we even get into a saddle, there's lots of pieces that we can actually pick apart. Now, some people might argue, oh, that's not going to give me the full picture. No, it's not. Right? It's not meant to be a fix-all, but it is intended to help us train our eye and our feel before we get on to look for more than just the standard, does it clear the wither, does it sit or rock? Because so much of what ends up happening to our bodies in a saddle actually starts with how the saddle is sitting on the horse's back. And does it work for them and their balance point? And then once we get on ourselves, something that we can do is sit in the saddle as we normally would. Have someone take a photo of you directly from the side. And I love my iPhone. I use the markup app all the time because it's got a ruler in it. And you can tilt that ruler to 0 degrees or anywhere in between. So I always recommend drawing a vertical line from shoulder, hip, and heel in where your saddle naturally puts you. This also will help us gauge, okay, how straight is my alignment naturally? So I want you to not reposition yourself. I just want you to get into your saddle, sit where you normally sit, have your leg where it would normally be, even if you need to walk around a few times so that you're in a natural position for where that saddle puts you, and then get that photo. I also then want you to look at how much room is behind your seat and in front of your seat. And that seems like a really simple gauge, but sometimes what we'll notice is, oh, my leg is maybe ahead of the girth. And my seat, maybe I only have 2 or 3 fingers by my seat, but I have 6 fingers in front of my seat. So that might be an indicator that the balance point of that saddle is further back than you need it to be for your bodily alignment. Then we could also drop our stirrups, scoot our bum to the middle of the saddle. So if you're noticing you sit a little too far back, drop the stirrups, scoot forward, and just drop the leg. Let it hang in a natural position under your body. And then take another photo of that. Because if we see, okay, we have a ton of saddle out in front of the flap, perhaps, like maybe the flap really protrudes way past where our femur wants to sit, or we see, again, a discrepancy in maybe the low point of the seat is now behind us, that's a good indicator that we're always going to be fighting those components of our saddle. Similarly, if we girth our saddle up and before we hop on, we take some photos, we can see, okay, where's the natural balance point? So ideally, we've been taught to think about pommel height relative to cantle height. So where does the front of our saddle sit relative to the back of our saddle? Now that's limiting because if we have a tree, for example, that's designed for a tall withered horse, we might have quite a pronounced upslope in our pommel angle. Because ideally we want that tree shape to match our horse's wither and back shape. So sometimes what we end up with is a really tall pommel, not an overly tall cantle. But the primary importance is that our lowest point is centered on that seat. So we can have a tall pommel because we've got a saddle that's really out of balance, or we can have a tall pommel in a saddle that's totally balanced, depending on the tree shape. So I don't ever recommend judging pommel to cantle ratio as an accurate measure of balance in a saddle because there's so many pieces. A lot of jump saddles especially have a pretty low cantle. A lot of dressage saddles have a really high cantle. So something could look balanced, but then we see where that low spot is. And if it's too far forward, chances are that's rotating our pelvis forward and making it really hard to sit on our seat pockets and actually engage our core and sit tall. That's going to impact our horse's ability to get off the forehand. It's going to impact their ability to elevate in their upward and downward transitions, engage their hind end properly. So that often will look like if we've got a forward balance point, you can ask yourself, does my horse run into the upward transitions? Do they collapse a little into the downward transitions? Do they struggle with collection? So where their body is required to compress a little more, engage the hind end, lift the front, and have a little bit more roundness in the center, is that hard for them? Because if so, chances are either we're looking at a natural balance or strength issue, or we're looking at a saddle-related balance issue. Because similarly, much if we're fighting the balance, they end up fighting that too. And if we're getting too much of the rider's weight and too much of the saddle's pressure forward on the horse's back, and especially what often happens then is we get more compression of our thoracic trapezius muscle, is we just get this hollowing effect in the horse's top line, which then makes all these other pieces really difficult, if not impossible for them. So seeing if my saddle's lowest point forward of center or backward of center, that might help you understand why you're either getting tipped forward or getting a little bit left behind. So those are just some simple kind of gauges. And again, I'll link those other resources. I'll send them your way so that you've got those for people to look at, because I find often seeing a visual is really helpful because sometimes we're splitting hairs. That balance point might only be a centimeter forward of center, which can be hard to see visually, or it can be hard to tell. But when you see it in a comparison photo of correct balance, maybe in a tall pommeled saddle or correct balance in a tall cantled saddle, we can start to just train our eye and see different ways to test it. So you can put a pencil or like a nicely rounded pen on your seat and see where it settles. That can be a really good gauge to see, does it sit in the middle or is it forward or backward of center? And I like to do that both with no pads under our saddle and with whatever pads we normally ride in, because both of those will give us often different pieces of information that we can use.
I just want to say, thinking about my next question for you, which is what's missing or what would you like to see more of in especially the saddle fit world for people doing professional saddle fitting out there? So that was my next question. And I think about what you're talking about. We just need more Katrinas out there. But however, for me, I go, I really appreciate talking to someone who obviously understands saddle fit so well that they've created their own brand, but also someone who understands the mechanics. And it's surprising to me how often I run into saddle fitters who, again, everyone is on their own learning path and there's always room to learn, but they may not understand how horses should move and how the saddle could help them. So for me, I'm answering the question for me that I was about to answer you. And I'm like, I wish that more saddle fitters had a general understanding about how movement and saddle fit interact. So I might either say you can build on that, or what pieces do you wish that you saw more in your industry?
Great question. I really wish that there was more relevance and importance placed on tree shapes and more development of varying tree shapes from the companies that are out there. Not only that, but also more adjustability, because at the end of the day, we always start with the tree shape first. And I'm just reminded of a client that I was speaking to prior to coming on today to chat with you. And the tree shape that they have is probably a little curvier than what their horse needs. But they're married, I think, to that brand, even if it's not necessarily working as well as it could for the horse. And so the tricky thing is sometimes if we've got the wrong shape or the wrong twist width or the wrong twist location, all of those things will create more movement and shifting in the saddle. So as a starting point, just having more tree shapes is a huge piece because a lot of brands, maybe on average, will have 3 to 5 tree shapes. And then every saddle is built on that tree. And what we typically see, say, for example, in our French saddle, is they sit the rider in every single tree. And then they get the rider to pick what they like the best. That's not how saddle fitting works. It's if I tell you, here, try small, medium, and large pants and tell me which one you like best. There, it's obvious which one fits or doesn't fit. But if we're leaving it solely up to the rider to pick the tree that actually the horse should be in, and we don't have much variation in those tree shapes, we're already starting at a disadvantage because then we're relying on panels, so the part that touches the horse's back, to compensate for whatever that tree shape is lacking. And for example, we have a flatter tree shape on a tall, withered horse. Now we're counting on paneling to lift that back so the balance point is level. But ultimately, we're always going to end up compromised as a result of that because the pressure is dictated by the shape of the tree, not just the shape of the panel. So a flat tree on a curvy horse, you're always going to have too much pressure at the front and back, regardless of how you panel it. And often if we build up the rear, we're just going to end up with more pressure in that spot where we've added paneling because the tree shape isn't actually designed for that type of horse. And so that in combination with short tree points are another big challenge. Our thoracic trapezius is not intended to be weight bearing, and yet the vast majority of saddles sit right on it. That's where our tree points sit. And so not only are we blocking scapular rotation with that, but we're also putting significantly more pressure in that area when it's not designed to carry weight. So that's how we often end up with these deep atrophied pockets in horses. And so we see that a ton in our jumping horses, especially. And then we're wondering why they aren't engaging themselves, why they aren't lifting themselves properly, why they aren't softer in the bridle, why they're inverting. And so much of it comes down to how the saddle is preventing them from being able to use their body the way it's intended to be used.
One thing I found interesting when I was researching for this episode was looking at your line of saddles, which I know we're coming to the end of our time here, but I think it actually would be good to build off of what you just said. I really appreciated the large span of variety that you have as options in your saddle line. And I really enjoyed actually reading some of your, where's that word? Come on, brain. Reviews. I actually enjoyed reading some of your reviews because I saw I think it was one customer that was talking about trying to find a tree shape for the sport that they were in that would work for their big, flat, round horse. I think it might have been a hoop tree comment. But anyways, I just went, yeah, so Katrina really gets it and is trying to provide as much adjustability that can work for these different body shapes as possible. And I think I have that right. Yeah, that's pretty significant value of your business.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, so back to the Ellie story, the adjustability piece is huge because I remember at one point I'd been tracking her for about, I can't remember, like 4 or 5 months maybe, and she'd only changed about a half centimeter. And I was like, "Yes, okay, she's finally leveling out. I'm going to buy an Equip." And I love Equips. They have a huge range of tree shapes, and they are one of the few naturally foam paneled saddles that now you can get a wool panel and they have an adjustable tree. The tricky thing is with any standard adjustable tree, we have a max wiggle room of 2 centimeters. So if we are putting a saddle into a tree press, we can only move that tree a maximum of 2 centimeters without compromising the structural integrity of our head plate. So
Okay.
it's risky business. We don't want to be adjusting these saddles a ton, and we can't in terms of how often or how much we adjust them. So I got this saddle. It came in 7 weeks. I was like, this is amazing. I was so excited because I'd been making do for so long. And I thought, this is such a treat for both of us. And Emma, that saddle came and I put it on her and it sat like this. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. But I'm like, did I mess up? Did I measure her incorrectly? Did they mess up? Did they make it incorrectly? And so I break out her tracings. I measure her. No, she had gained 3.5 centimeters in under 2 months. And I was like, how? And this horse was 13 at this point, I should add. We're not talking a young horse because that's a really common misconception. People think like horses only fluctuate when they're younger or when they're older. Especially if your horse isn't moving around consistently. If you have a stalled horse, chances are they're fluctuating by 1 or more centimeters in any given kind of 2 to 3 month period. We see a ton of fluctuation in a lot of stalled horses. And so I could not adjust that saddle enough to make it work. So I had this brand new custom saddle that I was so excited about. And like from the day it arrived, it was just an absolute no-go. So there was a huge need that I realized more and more throughout my time with Ellie and in my saddle fitting experience for saddles to be adjustable. And in our line, we offer a universal gullet system. So it comes with 6 different sizes. And on the side of accessibility, because I see the impact financially, emotionally, mentally that saddle struggles have on people, and I see the outcome for the horses. If we can't afford a new saddle for them, they are the ones that end up suffering. But we end up suffering too because we know that they're not comfortable. We're trying to work through all of these behavioral things that come up as a result of the saddle not working. And we feel guilty because we can't get them something different. Because often we've spent all of our money on the last saddle that we had, or the ulcer treatment that we just put them through, or the last set of vet work to try and figure out what was going on behaviorally. And it became really crucial for me to develop saddles that were more affordable, more adjustable, and just generally more accessible, as well as being more customizable. So we don't want riders struggling in their position, in their body. We don't want them compromising in fit. And we don't want the horse having to compromise either because their bodies are always changing. So that became really the cornerstone of Lovas and why I put so much into developing different saddles. Almost all of our saddles are built on completely different trees. We only have, I think, 2 saddles in our dressage line that are on the same tree, and it's our most popular tree, but we've done 2 different options in terms of the rider to really give people what they need as well as what their horse needs and make the adjustability piece more accessible for people as well.
So I'm going to encourage people to check out your website. And now I absolutely one day will be buying one of your saddles. I am sold. It is Lovas Equestrian.com. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Yes. And for your saddle fitting, Highland Saddle, and that is that highlandsaddles.com? What do you, yeah?
Yeah.
And we'll link to all of these in the podcast notes, of course.
Perfect.
But yeah, before we close things up here, are there any kind of final notes or any notes that we didn't hit that you'd like to either promote or anything that you wish that you could say?
So I think one of the things that I would leave people with is just encouragement to go with your gut. If you have a feeling that something is not quite right with your saddle, it never hurts to have it looked at and or to have a preliminary look yourself. Again, we'll link the saddle fitting guide in the Horse and Hand series. I think one of the biggest things I see people struggling with is who to trust when it comes to saddle fitting knowledge and advice. And the navigation of that landscape is really tricky. Because the fact of the matter is, even in some of the top saddle fitting studies that are being done in the world, they found that by and large, a lot of the time saddle fitters don't necessarily agree on things. So that makes it really difficult for the average person to navigate. And it makes it really difficult for us as saddle fitters because there's so much conflicting information all the time. That said, your horse will tell you, like with almost guaranteed certainty, if they're more comfortable when you make a change or less comfortable. And so sometimes what I recommend is just embracing the knowing that you know your horse best. If something has crept up as an issue where they used to have clean changes and that stopped, they didn't unlearn how to do those changes. There is a physical barrier there, whether it's pain related due to something in their body or pain related due to the saddle. Something's restricting that. And so often I see, and I think we talked a bit about this as well, and we see almost this expectation or this idea like that they should be doing something or they used to do it and now they won't do it. Just know if they won't do something suddenly, it's probably that they can't. And when we see changes, like they can't pick up that lead or they can't do a clean change anymore or they're pinning their ears or swishing their tail, those are all really clear signs that there's a discomfort piece usually there. And if we can look at and break down some of the very functional and easy to ascertain pieces of saddle fit, you don't have to take my word for it. We know, hey, if a saddle's doing these things, that means that there's an issue in terms of the way it's fitting the horse. And if we're seeing those on the ground, chances are they're manifesting as some behavioral or training type issues under saddle. So that's a big one because I know with Ellie, I was constantly told she just needs to get over it. I feel underneath my saddle every day. And I've always done that since learning the importance of it and having a really sensitive horse who wouldn't tolerate discomfort. And it was wild. Like I would ride one day, have maybe the best ride ever. She might have a day or two off, or my co-owner would ride and then she'd have a day off. And I'd come out the next day and I'd feel and I'd be like, oh, it's a bit tight there today. And you know what? Sure enough, she would not be a happy camper. Like she would be giving me the middle finger left and center. And I feel like, what the heck? But guaranteed it was because of the saddle. And some days I'd come out and my saddle will be hitting me in the bum, whereas the ride before that, it wasn't. So sometimes there's really tangible things like that. And other times it's a little bit more insidious where things just start to change slowly. But if you're noticing your horse is moving away from your saddle when you go to tack up, if they are pinning their ears, tossing their heads, swishing their tail when you tack up, they don't want to come to the mounting block, they're hollowing their back when you get on or when you go to dismount. Those are all clear signs that there's a discomfort related piece there, and it wouldn't hurt to assess your saddle.
That is the most lovely note to end on. What I'm hearing here from Katrina is don't discount the little signals, sometimes big signals. Listen to your gut and explore. There's a solution out there. Thank you so much, Katrina. This was delightful. We will absolutely be inviting you on again. And I will just say, yeah, we'll make sure that everything, all links that lead to Katrina will end up in the show notes. And I'll just say that's a wrap.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me. That was great. I always appreciate our conversations and the perspective that you bring in. That's wonderful.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. My goal is to share information with people that they may not have had access to. So please share this podcast around. Do all the things. Rate, review, subscribe, donate. Let's keep this podcast going. And most important, go have fun with your horse. See you soon.